I'm gay!
If you know me, you know that I'm no stranger to mixing the devil's lettuce with video games. With previous videos, I've highlighted games that are generally pretty lighthearted and not overly graphic in nature. But not today. We're going to be taking some fat rips and looking at some genuinely creepy shit. Personally, I don't really think I'd be able to handle games that feature a lot of jump scares. We're looking at games like Five Nights at Freddy's and Outlast, both of which I think would genuinely stress me out when I'm on the zaza. However, there is a subgenre that I think pairs perfectly well with ganja, specifically atmospheric horror. These are games that primarily try to scare you through the overall feelings that they invoke. These games also really excel at fully immersing you through their creepy and disturbing settings. We'll be taking a look at some mainstream titles that most people have probably already heard about, but I also wanted to take a look at some indie horror games, some of which take direct inspiration from those mainstream titles. So without further ado, grab the nearest bowl and join me on this journey as we look at horror games that pair well with weed. By far, probably the most well-known series that pretty much set the bar for atmospheric horror. At first, I never really knew much about Silent Hill, besides the fact that it looked like a grungier version of Resident Evil. One day I smoked some reefer and ended up with the soundtrack recommended to me on YouTube. And god damn, I was just blown away by how chill and relaxing some of these tracks can be. If you don't know anything about the series, each game follows a different protagonist that for whatever reason ends up getting trapped in the foggy town of Silent Hill. The town itself is shrouded in mystery, and more often than not, it's seen as a way for each protagonist to deal with their traumatic past. As opposed to, just going to a regular old therapy session. It does take place in the US after all. Their trauma often manifests itself into these disgusting and grotesque creatures, and it's on you to either avoid them or bonk them to death with the nearest metal pipe. These games do a lot of amazing things to make you feel super unnerved, like famously jumping down multiple gaping holes, conversations with other people in the town that feel intentionally weird and almost dreamlike, and also changing the layout of places you've been to before to keep you constantly unfamiliar with the layout. The other thing that this series is famous for is its insanely difficult puzzles, the most famous being this piano puzzle in the original game, where you need to hit the right piano notes based off of some obscure poem about birds. If you're not actively looking up a walkthrough for these games, a lot of the puzzles are going to leave you looking like this. And this is probably the one aspect that I just feel doesn't work very well with ganja. Specifically, my baked brain couldn't remember that the item that I picked up 6 rooms ago now finally has a purpose in this one random situation. There's not a ton of games that have been able to replicate the success of Silent Hill, but there are 2 indie games that I think replicates that same atmosphere perfectly. Lone Survivor takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where you play as a guy who just really wants to escape his apartment complex. Unlike Silent Hill, which takes you to multiple locations, Lone Survivor primarily takes place in this large apartment complex, so I would argue that it's easier to memorize the building and the various doors that you need to unlock there. I also felt more of a personal connection with the protagonist in this game, as you not only have to manage their physical health, but also their mental health as well. Each day, your main priority is to find the main character something to eat. The protagonist will even start to complain if you continue to just feed him junk food on a daily basis. You also need to remember to actively sleep, in order to prevent the main character from going completely insane. The soundtrack feels very reminiscent of Silent Hill, and it's even got some Twin Peaks vibes to it too. I never found the puzzles in this one to be too obtuse, which was also really nice to see. I can't talk too much more about the game without spoiling, but if you love all things Silent Hill, and you've been in a drought since, they haven't made a new mainline game since 2004, I highly recommend this one. One other indie game in this genre that I'd like to give a shout out to is Detention. The game takes place in Taiwan during the 1960s. Similar to Lone Survivor, you play as a pair of students who end up getting trapped in their school from a typhoon. As you attempt to escape the super creepy hallways, you start to unearth some ugly truths not only about the protagonist, but also about the gruesome time period that the game sets itself in. If you've ever wandered through a school at nighttime, this game gives off those same eerie and really lonely vibes. Unfortunately, I did find the puzzles to be a bit more on the confusing side, even more so towards the end of the game. But if you can get past that, it's a really great atmospheric horror game in its own right.
Pay attention, Daniel. It's important that you keep going straight. And make sure not to stray.
It's no surprise that I have to include the king of first-person horror, a game that pretty much set the mechanics for all first-person horror games to come, stripping the player of all resources and forcing you to run and hide from all of the enemies. If for whatever reason you haven't heard of it, the game takes place in a creepy, medieval Prussian castle. You play as Daniel, a Londoner who woke up with no memory of who he is or how he ended up there. The general atmosphere of wandering the castle, picking up notes that hint at some of the terrible things that happen there, is really unmatched. The game also introduced the sanity mechanic. Standing in darkness for too long causes your character to hallucinate. As your sanity continues to decrease, your vision will not only start to distort, but objects in the environment will also start to become more sinister. Your sanity also actively decreases if you look directly at the monsters, which is genius and just adds to the mystery of never quite knowing what exactly is chasing you throughout the castle hallways. If for whatever reason you've never played this masterpiece, drop what you're doing, grab the nearest bowl, and start getting genuinely freaked out by this suspenseful classic. But if you've already played it like me and many others and are looking for something extremely similar, I have just the thing. Mundaun takes place in the old-timey Swiss Alps. Our protagonist ventures out to his home village in the mountains to attend his grandfather's funeral. But when he gets there, he comes to find his grandfather's corpse burned into the side of a building, essentially insinuating that the body is cursed. You'll notice right off the bat that the game features a really unique art style, with all of the graphics presented as pencil-shaded drawings. Every character you meet also talks in old-timey Romansh, which further adds to the isolation you feel when you're exploring the small villages. I remember when I first played this, I took a really strong edible and just remember staring at the paintings. Not because the paintings were pretty or anything, but because the longer you stare at the paintings, you start to hear the paintings, man. This game also has its fair share of weird puzzles, but I never ended up having any issues or having to use a guide to solve them. But again, if you're looking for something to match both the same gameplay mechanics as well as the tense atmosphere as Amnesia, Mundaun is a great pick. When it comes to atmospheric horror, there was one other indie title that I just had to mention on this list. This game is a mix of a lot of different genres, and the easiest way that I can explain it is that obviously you have the top-down gameplay of something like Hotline Miami, but also paired with a lot of resource gathering and crafting. There's also a day and night schedule that keeps you on your toes as you attempt to gather enough resources to survive the night. Oddly enough, a lot of those mechanics reminded me of Pikmin, just in a really, really darker setting. Every time night falls, you run the risk of getting overwhelmed by the many horrific creatures that inhabit the land. That is, unless you properly prepare your hideout. That's right, on top of all the previous mechanics I mentioned, they also added a bit of a tower defense system. With all that being said, I did sometimes find myself getting a bit overwhelmed by the amount of things that you need to keep track of. But once you get past Chapter 1 and come to understand the many different gameplay mechanics, there really is no better horror game to play on the Zaza. I also need to give a shout out to the sound designers here because it's so good. Like, it does a great job at just making you feel extremely uncomfortable. The game is also procedurally generated, so not every playthrough will be exactly the same. The nighttime tower defense encounters are also procedurally generated, so different enemies have a chance to show up to your doorstep each night. There were some nights my protagonist didn't encounter any enemies and would just be seeing random hallucinations around his hideout. Even towards the later stages of the game, as much as I prepared my setup by using traps and boarding up all my windows, the game continued to surprise me and find completely new ways to kick my ass. I played this game on PlayStation 5, and it's one of the few games that really uses the adaptive triggers really well. I also just want to reiterate that this game is absolutely terrifying. Not through jump scares, but through the atmosphere alone. It could just be me, but there were many times that I just wanted to put the controller down and have a short cry in the corner. That's how truly freaky and weird a lot of the imagery in this game can be. While this list primarily covers atmospheric horror games, I'm sure there's some psychos out there that love to play a game of cat and mouse with the creepy daddy in Resident Evil 7, or even roaming that terrifying, jump scare filled house of Visage. If there's any atmospheric horror games you recommend, please let me know, as I'm eager to see more games in this genre in general. I also recently played through the entirety of the OG Silent Hill 2 while under the influence, all of which is currently uploaded on my Patreon. And if you haven't done so this month, do yourself a favor. Grab a joint, turn off the lights, and fully immerse yourself into one of your favorite horror games.